The cruelest mistake a man can make is discovering the truth after he has already destroyed the only person who loved him. The wind howled across the stone towers of Ravensshire Manor, rattling the tall windows and bending the ancient oak trees that lined the long gravel drive. Inside the grand hall, candlelight flickered against cold marble floors while servants stood frozen along the walls, their eyes lowered, pretending not to hear what was unfolding at the massive front doors. Had carried into the chapel. "You married a duke," he said quietly. "Not a fool." Clara took a step toward him, her heart pounding. "Sebastian, please listen to me. I would never. Enough." The word was calm, but absolute. The duke turned toward the open doors where rain now drifted lightly across the threshold. The carriage lanterns outside glowed faintly through the fog rolling across the long drive. For a brief moment something flickered in his eyes. Doubt perhaps, or hesitation. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He looked back at her with the same cold authority that had made half the county fear him. "Leave this house," he said. Clara blinked, certain she had misunderstood. "Believe what I can see," he replied at last. Clara stepped forward despite the rain gathering at the hem of her gown. "Then look at me." The words slipped out before she could stop them. For the first time that night, the Duke hesitated. His eyes lifted from the paper and met hers fully. For a brief and dangerous second the vast hall seemed to fall away around them. There was no letter, no watching servants, no storm, only the quiet memory of the small church that morning where Clara Bennet had walked down the aisle with steady hands and hopeful eyes. But Sebastian had built his life on caution, began to move before Clara Bennet had fully settled against the worn leather seat. The horses stepped forward into the rain-soaked darkness, their hooves muffled against the long gravel drive that stretched nearly a mile from Ravensshire Manor to the iron gates at the edge of the estate. Clara did not look back. The castle towers faded behind the sheets of rain, their windows glowing faintly like distant stars through the storm. Only hours earlier those lights had seemed like the beginning of a new life. Now they looked like something far colder, something she had never truly belonged to. The driver spoke only once through the small window between them. "It is about 5 miles to the village, miss." His voice carried the careful politeness of a man who had served the Whitmore family for many years and knew better than to ask questions. Accepted it without opening it. For a moment the driver seemed uncertain whether to say more, but years of service had taught him that silence was often the safest kindness. He tipped his hat respectfully before climbing back into the carriage. Clara watched the lanterns disappear down the road as the carriage turned and began the long return to Ravensshire Manor. When the sound of the horses finally faded, the village seemed impossibly quiet. A soft bell chimed somewhere in the distance from the small church at the end of the street. Clara drew a slow breath and turned toward the inn door, wrapped around her like a gentle contrast to the cold night outside, stared at it as though it belonged to someone else, casting warm rectangles across the wooden floor while the children leaned over their slates with determined concentration. Clara Bennet moved slowly between the desks, helping a young boy shape the letters of the alphabet with careful patience. The boy frowned at first, his tongue pressed against the corner of his mouth in deep concentration. But when the letter finally appeared correctly on the slate, his face brightened with a proud smile. Clara returned the smile gently. It had been many years since she had last sat in a room like this. Yet the simple act of guiding a child through the first steps of learning felt strangely natural. At the front of the room, the elderly teacher, Mrs. Dalton, watched quietly with thoughtful eyes. When the lesson ended and the children hurried outside to enjoy their short break in the sunshine, she approached Clara slowly. "You have done this before," Mrs. Dalton said, not as a question but as an observation. Clara folded her hands together and shook her head softly. "Not officially," she answered. "But my mother believed every child deserved to read the world around them." Mrs. Dalton studied her for a moment, clearly noticing the careful way Clara spoke and the quiet grace in her posture. "You are not from a village like this," the teacher said gently. Clara did not deny it. Instead, she looked out the window where the children now chased one another along the grassy edge of the churchyard. Their laughter carried lightly through the open door. "I suppose life has a way of changing our plans," she said quietly. Mrs. Dalton nodded as though she understood far more than Clara had said. "Then perhaps this change has brought you here for a reason." Meanwhile, several miles away, the towering walls of Ravensshire Manor stood silent beneath a clearing sky. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the long gardens washed clean and bright beneath the morning sun. Inside the vast study of the West Wing, Sebastian Whitmore sat alone at his desk. The room smelled faintly of leather and old books, yet the familiar surroundings offered him little comfort. The letter still rested on the desk before him. The same letter that had arrived just hours before the wedding ceremony. The same letter that had convinced him Clara Bennett had married him only for his wealth. Sebastian had read the words many times through the night, each sentence confirming the careful suspicion that had shaped his life for years. Yet something about the paper had begun to trouble him. Slowly he lifted the letter again, studying the handwriting beneath the light of the tall window. It looked similar to Clara's script. Similar, but not exact. Sebastian's eyes narrowed slightly as he compared it with a document resting nearby. The marriage registry from the church. Clara Bennett's true signature. The difference was subtle, yet unmistakable. A small curve in one letter. A slight slant in another. His hand tightened around the paper as a cold realization began to settle in his mind. Outside the window, the gardens of Ravensheim stretched peacefully toward the distant hills, but inside the study a quiet doubt had begun to grow. For the first time since the night before, the Duke of Ravensheim wondered whether he had made a mistake that could not easily be undone. The quiet doubt that had settled in Sebastian Whitmore's mind did not leave him as the morning hours passed. The Duke remained seated in his study while sunlight slowly moved across the tall windows and warmed the dark wooden floor. The letter rested on the desk before him beside the marriage registry from the church, and the difference between the two signatures refused to disappear no matter how many times he examined them. Clara Bennett had written her name with a gentle upward curve at the end of the final letter. The signature on the letter ended sharply, almost hurried, as though written by someone attempting to copy a style rather than owning it. Sebastian leaned back slowly in his chair, his eyes fixed on the paper. A single doubt had begun to grow into something far more troubling. If the letter had not been written by Clara, then someone had wanted him to believe it was. The study door opened quietly behind him as the old butler, Mr. Hawthorne, stepped inside carrying a small tray of morning tea. The man had served the Whitmore family for nearly 40 years, and moved through the room with quiet familiarity. He set the tray down carefully before noticing the unusual tension in the Duke's expression. "Is everything satisfactory this morning, Your Grace?" the butler asked gently. Sebastian did not immediately answer. His gaze remained fixed on the two signatures lying side by side.